in World War One. Now you may get this as just about one specific weapon. It could be a source about machine guns or artillery guns or something like that. Or it could be something that is a much more open question in terms of an 8-mark answer about what you would say about technology during the First World War. So the 5 things that you need to talk about in terms of weapons. The first one is the artillery guns. Now the artillery guns were the weapon that caused the most death during the First World War. So in that sense it would be seen as the most effective, simply because they're using the tactic of attrition and you want to kill more of them than they kill of you. Now to start with in the war, it's a bit embarrassing, but basically they were really inaccurate. And sometimes they fired the artillery guns and they actually hit the people in their own front line of trenches, which obviously was very embarrassing for the generals, and had to keep working out where they could move them so that wouldn't happen. So they were inaccurate. But what they used them for was to do the barrage before the men would go over the top, and they obviously did do a lot of damage to other people's trenches. But the reason why there's lots of craters in no man's land is simply because what happens is sometimes when they couldn't reach the enemy lines, they just blew a hole into no man's land. So that's why those craters are there and often filled up with water, making life even harder for the men that would be going over the top. So the artillery guns were very effective, but they also resulted in some men having shell shock, because that constant fire of those artillery guns just went on all day, and it got to a lot of them. And it wasn't just that though that gave them shell shock. Obviously they were living on the nerves and things as well. Right, machine guns. So machine guns were also a really effective weapon in the First World War and did result in millions of deaths. But what you should make sure that you absolutely are certain of here, they were just defensive weapons. They were defensive weapons because they were at the front line of the trenches and they would wait for the enemy to run onto the machine guns and then they would start firing. And you needed 2 people to work one of the machine guns because they were extremely heavy, and one of them had to obviously turn the gun to shoot at people, and the other person would be putting the bullets through so they didn't get stuck. So to begin with, they were a little bit limiting because they were only defensive. But later on in the war, they then made some lighter ones that were submachine guns. Now obviously they were still pretty heavy, but you could actually take them out into no man's land or change positions with them. So that was towards the end of the war. So that's what happened with the machine guns in terms of that. Poison gas. Strangely, although poison gas actually only killed 3,000 men during the First World War, which was nothing compared to the artillery guns and the machine guns, it was the one that people were most scared of. And it was because it was a horrific death. You could take weeks to die after a gas attack, and also there was lots of other side effects. Some were temporarily blinded, which really frightened them, and if you didn't die during the war from a gas attack, if you'd been caught in one, it would be probably that after the war you would die quite soon from some sort of lung disease. So it was pretty horrific. And there was 2 types of gas. There was mustard gas and chlorine gas. And they were known as silent killers because obviously you couldn't hear it coming. But the chlorine gas was a greeny bluey type of shade, like what you get chlorine in a swimming pool. And the thing with that was it became a bit more obvious that the gas attack was coming, but people had to quickly get their gas masks on because if they started to breathe that in, it was already too late. Now the gas masks were provided, but they certainly weren't perfect. There was a gap underneath here that if you didn't get it completely on, it could mean that it could still get in there and then you were sort of drowning underneath your gas mask. And people said about how horrific it was to actually watch people die from gas attacks. Now with the poison gas as well, the first time it was ever used was by the Germans in 1915, and unfortunately they really couldn't believe what had happened. It was a windy day and the wind blew the gas back on their own troops, so there certainly was drawbacks to gas, but it still didn't stop people using poison gas as a weapon during the First World War. Tanks. Tanks are another weapon in World War I. And Churchill, yes, the person who was Prime Minister in World War II for us, at this point he was in charge of the Navy in World War I. But he was also interested in looking at other technology that could possibly help us to win the First World War. So he helped to get some funding for tanks to be made, And obviously it was good because that was a weapon that the Germans didn't have. That has to be a positive, really. So what ended up happening in terms of the tanks is they only went 4 miles per hour. So they went at walking pace. So this made it extremely difficult for the people who were the tank men in the First World War. One, because often the soldiers could outrun the tanks, even though the tanks were meant to be leading the way. And also another problem is they were easy to attack. So men could get on the tanks and throw grenades in, so German soldiers could do that, and then obviously then the tank would blow up. And the problems, unfortunately, didn't stop there. 50% of tanks actually broke down, and this is a huge number considering that they were meant to be a really offensive weapon in World War I to help us break through enemy lines. The thing you could say about it though is it did give the troops confidence. The British felt good that they actually had these big machines, something that the Germans hadn't had. But there was lots of problems with tanks as well in trench warfare because obviously the no man's land area was muddy and sometimes they really just got stuck or started to sink into the mud because they were so heavy. Aeroplanes. This is the final weapon that you'd need to talk about in terms of the First World War. So just to put some statistics there for you, in 1915 there was only 37 planes that we had, and by 1918 there was 23,000. So as the war went on, the British and the other countries became more aware of what the planes could do for victory in World War I. Let's make this clear though, the war in the air is not a deal breaker for the First World War because technology is still not advanced enough for them to be flying really long distances even by 1918. So this is quite amusing in a way in terms of how they tried to get people to join the Royal Air Corps in those days. They used to say that if you joined, you'd be one of the flying aces. So you'd be in the newspapers all the time, you'd be popular with women. So people, obviously, young men, were attracted to that and thought, oh, I'll sign up. They also got offered really, really good pay. And you'll see in a minute when I talk to you about in terms of the pay and how long the life expectancy is. Of course they get good pay because the training would only be around 2 weeks, and the reason for that was your life expectancy was only 10 days in the Royal Air Force. So if that is the case, they didn't want them to train for too long in case they died when they were doing the training. Nevertheless, people did join up to do that, and in 1914 there was lots of accidents with planes. They were made from piano wire, canvas and wood. So quite honestly, you wouldn't have got me anywhere near one of those planes. And people did it because they thought it might be more glamorous than being part of the infantry, than the land army. So that's why obviously they started to do it. So something that is important about the Air Force as well is that the aeroplanes to begin with were just used for reconnaissance or spying. They went over enemy trenches and they basically took photographs of what they were doing, and they also went back and reported to people behind our lines. Yes, they did do things like throw bricks down as well to hit Germans and things in the enemy trench. That totally did happen. And the first time they used guns, sometimes they used handguns that by accident shot the propellers off, and they also thought they'd got a gun on the front of the plane to help, but again, that shot the propellers off. So there was loads and loads of accidents. But like anything, war really, really does push on technology because you always want to stay ahead of your enemy. So planes by 1917 had become far, far better. And this allowed them to have dogfights in the air, so they're actually firing at each other from up there. The guns were much more stable on the planes and obviously then didn't hit the propellers, and they could fly longer distances. So the plane became much more important towards the end of the war than anything it could be used with to start with in 1914.